Hi and welcome to this CommonSpace reaction video to the SNP Growth Commission motion and debate. It was absolutely fascinating debate and a fascinating result. The motion passed, but it was passed with Amendment D, which argued that independent currency should be introduced as soon as is practicable, quote unquote, after Independence Day. Now that didn't explicitly take away the 6 tests on the introduction of the Scottish currency, but those that argue in favour of that amendment will absolutely demolish the 6 tests, were vociferous in opposition to it. So I think there's going to be a battle of interpretations over what this vote means. Yeah. I'm here with David Jameson, CommonSpace reporter. David, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I think the battle of interpretation now begins. First of all, I have to say I wasn't really expecting that outcome.
No.
I didn't think that D would pass. And it's testimony to all the people who've been campaigning to overturn aspects of the Growth Commission, particularly on currency, that passed. This is a real upset. I mean, it will be being spun right now as not an upset, but it definitely is. And I think in all the SNP conferences that I've been to, this is the biggest breakthrough for grassroots SNP activists. So now it comes down to a battle of interpretation over exactly what is meant by Amendment D. You see, the SNP leadership's already briefing almost that nothing has changed.
Yes.
So the 6 tests are still there. As soon as practicable is what the 6 tests already meant in a sense. There is, I think, quite a big important technical difference. And as you say, there's a big difference between what was being debated and what was actually voted on in the fine print, in the small print on Amendment D. But even actually, if you look technically at Amendment D, one of the things it does is remove the final paragraph where the so-called central bank would have submitted annual reports to an independent Scottish Parliament, and then they would have deliberated on whether or not to set up an independent currency based upon the central bank's recommendation, based upon the 6 tests. So I'm not convinced.
They're gone.
Well, the central bank annual reports are gone.
Yeah.
So it's unclear at this point what the mechanism is by which the 6 tests are actually applied to the setting up of an independent currency.
Or if they are in all effect redundant.
Yes, yeah, and this is the thing. Like I say, there will now be a fierce argument of interpretation over whether or not the 6 tests still apply. And I have to say, I think there's very good scope to say that they don't.
We just had an SNP press officer come into the press room here at the SNP conference, and actually said that, in his view, Amendment D was in harmony with the 6 tests. And I said, well, the problem with that is that the mover of Amendment D, Tim Rideout, absolutely ripped through the 6 tests. The main point of his contribution was to oppose the 6 tests. And he said, well, I mean, it doesn't get rid of the 6 tests in the text of the motion. I think there's going to be a problem for the SNP leadership to sustain that position going forward, because if anyone, I mean, sure there's going to be recordings of the debate, anyone's seen the debate, they'll have to conclude that the 6 tests have been defeated in argument, if not in textual form in the motion.
Although, as I say, I think there is a textual confusion now.
Yes.
But, absolutely. The interesting thing was, see when, so Amendment B went down quite easily. I mean, we couldn't actually see the hands raised in the hall because of the way we were looking. C similarly fell quite quickly. Then D had to go to account and ultimately won. Mm-hmm. And honestly, what I think went on in the hall is they voted for the hardest amendment.
Absolutely.
So the speakers for D were the most vociferous in attacking the Growth Commission and sterlingisation in particular, and in particular the 6 tests. That, for me, was the floor of the conference, very particularly voting against the 6 tests. And the biggest applause was for when Tim Rideout demolished the 6 tests, which he did very, very succinctly. He pointed out very simply you could not meet the 6 tests without an independent currency, without a central bank, and that some of the 6 tests made very little sense. They weren't terribly sort of meaningful on their own terms. So it is a problem, I think, if the SNP's leadership is going to be the 6 tests remain, because the mood in the room, apart from anything else, was very, very opposed to the 6 tests.
And let's just talk a little bit about the debate itself, because it was a remarkable debate. What you really had was, on one side, those putting forward the amendments, the direct negative, the remit back, were very specific about their criticisms were very radical in their outlook about what they wanted from independence and why they thought this motion was wrong. They referenced things like the World Bank and IMF as this integrating us into those sort of typical global institutions. They said we don't want to be like the establishment in the Democratic Party, and they really took apart the case for the motion. In stark contrast to that, the people arguing in favour were, first of all, they were all senior politicians, so there was not one grassroots speaker from the SNP in favour. Pretty much all the speakers against were grassroots. And secondly, they were entirely vague in their propositions and sometimes bizarre, like you need to pass this motion unamended because we want to tackle poverty in Scotland after independence. I mean, just not making arguments against the amendments at all. In fact, very few arguments were made in response to those arguments for the amendments. So it was a really one-sided debate, and to be honest, it was a bit of a thump in the debate for the leadership position. Yeah,
I totally agree with that. I mean, Keith Brown was the only speaker for the Growth Commission who I think made any attempt at all to answer any of the criticisms, and on the other side was just a storm of criticisms. Mm-hmm. Actually, some of the ones that were made for Remit Back by Chris Stevens were some of the most interesting. Mm-hmm. So, for example, there's a lot of stuff in the leadership's motion that just wasn't included. Mm-hmm. There was nothing about financialisation. Someone else said there was no serious consideration of land and the economics of land, which is of course incredibly important in a country where there's such a concentrated form of land ownership. So there were all kinds of criticisms, actually ones that haven't come up so much up until now. Mm-hmm. You know, I mean, on CommonSpace, obviously we've hosted a lot of opinion articles and stuff, people criticising stuff. There's even more coming out once you get into the debate.
Very well thought out.
Very well thought out. The intellectual level on the behalf of the amendment movers, I thought was incredibly high. And I think that really those proposing the leadership's motion were not prepared to make the case, to make the argument. So, yeah, I thought that was very interesting as well. And I think that once members of the party have seen those arguments, seen that mood in the room and so forth, then it's hard to put that genie back in the bottle.
You described it as the biggest victory for the grassroots in a vote inside the SNP, and I think that's right. It's the biggest I can remember. The NATO debate in 2012 was a big debate, but ultimately the leadership position won and they decided to join NATO. It's worth reflecting on the fact that not one senior figure in the party backed Amendment D. Not one, MP, MSP. It was entirely grassroots push by, I think it was the Dalkeith branch in favour of it, and a stunning speech made by the person advocating Amendment D. So it's a real, I think it's an important moment for the party that the grassroots of the party have really got a big win here, and I think that has to be recognised.
I thought a very interesting thing was said by, I can't remember who said it, that almost all of the party's parliamentarians had stayed out the debate. Mm-hmm. And I don't know what was being pointed at there, except perhaps that, there's an understanding that there's a lot of disquiet in all corners of the party, including in the parliamentary groups in Holyrood and at Westminster. But yes, the debate as it actually came down on the day was all grassroots members versus, the leader of Glasgow City Council, one of the members of the finance team in the Holyrood Parliament. So yeah, I mean, it showed, for example, that the membership is prepared to stand on its own feet in that situation.
Well, that's us wrapping up our coverage from today. If you go to commonspace.scot, you'll be able to find news reports, analysis, videos of today's events at SNP conference. A very, very interesting result, a result that's going to have multiple interpretations, and CommonSpace will be discussing that further with SNP members and reporting on that in coming weeks. So visit commonspace.scot to keep on top of all that, and thanks for joining us.